Hello to all the listeners out there. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an associate editor for Hoards Dairyman magazine. Thank you for joining us today. It is my pleasure to co-host this webinar with Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois, and we are fortunate to have another esteemed speaker with us this month. His name is Bill Weiss, and he comes to us from the Ohio State University. His presentation is titled Feeding Cows to Reach Their Peak. A successful lactation starts with the transition period, and nutrition plays a major role in that. Dr. Weiss's presentation will focus on fresh cow rations, including protein, fat, amino acids, starch, and fiber. We look forward to hearing what Dr. Weiss has to say about this topic. This month's webinar is sponsored by QLF Quality Liquid Feeds. We are very pleased to have their support of this program. I would like to take a moment to thank our other team members, Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois, and our Hoards Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hirchin, who do the behind-the-scenes work to make sure everything is running smoothly. This presentation is being re-recorded from our original webinar, so we hope that you enjoy the information that Dr. Weiss is providing us today. Mike, would you please go ahead and further introduce our speaker and kickstart this month's webinar?
Well, very good, Abby, and it's a pleasure to have joined the group here today, and a pleasure to introduce a really good friend, a personal and professional friend, Dr. Bill Weiss. He's a veteran for Hoards Dairyman. He's been on several webinars there, and of course is a very popular presenter here in the United States and around the world. As Abby indicated, he is the professor of dairy cattle nutrition in the Department of Animal Sciences at The Ohio State University, and is located at Worcester, or as some of you know, OARDC, the abbreviation there. Bill earned his BS and master's degrees from Purdue University and his PhD from The Ohio State. And he was an assistant professor in North Dakota State University for a period of time before joining Ohio State in 1988. Abby pretty well listed some of the areas he works in here. He's got 125 journal articles, 350 popular press articles, has spoken in 40 states and 29 different countries. And many of you already know that he was one of the members of the 2001 Dairy NRC Committee and now serves as one of the co-chairs for the one that will be coming out hopefully in the next year, given the review process. The only problem Bill had is that he was the interim chair in the Department of Animal Science for a year, so he's one of those administrators. So, Bill, we'll turn the program over to you, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Abby, and good morning. Today, what I'm going to talk about, or first I want to say what I'm not going to talk about, even though it's critically important. I am not going to get into preventing metabolic diseases like hypocalcemia, DAs, etc. These, again, are extremely important, but I'm going to focus on other areas today. And what I'm going to talk about are carryover effects. In other words, how we feed these pre-fresh and fresh cows, the effect this will have later into lactation. I'm going to start with the pre-fresh diet. And again, I want to concentrate on lactation effects of a pre-fresh diet. I want to try and convince you of the value of a fresh group. And then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on, if you're going to have a fresh group, how you're going to feed that group of animals. There's been several studies, probably half dozen or so studies, looking at the effect of prepartum starch or energy on postpartum performance. I'm only going to talk about two, and the reason I picked these two are they're a little bit different than what's commonly found. This study here is out of Cornell, and they had 3 treatments. One, the blue bar here, is they fed a high starch, a relatively high starch diet for the whole dry period. That's the blue bar, 24% starch. The red bar here was a low starch diet, again, the entire dry period, 15%. The green bar here was the low starch for most of the dry period, 15%, and then 2 or 3 weeks prepartum, they switched these cows to a 20% starch diet. After calving, all cows went on the same lactation diet, which was 21% starch. I'm not showing the data here, but prepartum intakes did exactly what almost every study shows. If you feed higher starch, which means lower fiber, cows eat more. Prepartum, and that's exactly what this study found, like most other studies. The cows fed the 24% starch prepartum had higher intakes prepartum than the 15% starch. But also what's very, very common or consistent is once these cows calve, intake is independent of the starch in the prepartum diet. This is postpartum intake. And remember now, all the cows are fed the same diet. The treatment was prepartum. Intakes, these are kilos, but no effect whatsoever of prepartum starch on postpartum intake. Started at about 18 kilos, 35 pounds or so, and increased, but no effect. And again, that's very, very common, of no effect of intake. What they found, and this is a little different, not most of the studies don't find this, but what they found is those animals fed high starch prepartum produced more milk. They measured milk up through 6 weeks, more energy corrected milk than the cows fed the low starch diet prepartum, about 5 pounds a day average. But what's important to note here is that actual milk wasn't affected. So they're producing more energy corrected milk because the milk has higher fat. That's an indicator of fat mobilization. And remember, they ate the same. They're putting more energy out in milk. That energy has to come from somewhere, and it comes from the body. And the blood data supports that. The high starch during the dry period increased ketones and NEFAs. And over here you can see this is blood NEFAs, the blue bar, which again was the highest starch, highest NEFAs, the highest starch prepartum, highest ketones. So whether this is good or not is a debatable question. You do get milk, but it's coming at the cost of body. So higher starch, if you're having trouble managing body condition in these fresh cows, high starch prepartum is probably not advisable. If you can manage body condition and cows are in good shape, then maybe push starch a little bit prepartum. This second study used lower levels of starch. Same basic design. They imposed treatments prepartum, put all cows on a common diet postpartum. This study had a low starch control, 13% starch prepartum during most of the dry period, or excuse me, during the last several weeks of the dry period, compared to a 17. And in this study here, I am showing the prepartum intakes, and it did exactly what I said. You feed more starch prepartum, you get increased intake. That's very, very common. And this did exactly what the last study did. Postpartum, though, it had absolutely no effect on intake. So more intake prepartum does not mean higher intakes postpartum. And this study showed a lot of the same results as the previous one, in that the higher starch prepartum resulted in more milk the first, in this study, up through about 56 days. Somewhere around 5 or 8 pounds per day more milk for about 2 months. You can see the lactation curves there. But I want to remind you that this increased milk production is not the common response. The common response is no effect on milk production. But the studies where they got increased milk production, it generally comes at the cost of body mobilization. This is again very similar to what that first study showed. This is prevalence of subclinical ketosis, which is an indicator of mobilization of body fat, or a result of excess mobilization. In this study, they defined subclinical ketosis as cows with a serum BHBA level greater than 1 millimolar. Half the cows on the 17% starch were subclinically ketotic, compared to about 15% of the cows fed the low starch. So yes, they get more milk in some studies, but it almost always comes at the cost of increased mobilization. So what this is telling me is that if body condition is a challenge, you're going to be moderate in starch, maybe mid-teens, low to mid-teens in starch. If you can manage body condition in early lactation, you might push starch a little bit, 17 to 20% prepartum. On protein, again, Prefresh Protein on postpartum production. There's been a lot of studies, and rather than me going through all these, I'm going to choose 2 meta-analyses. And just to remind you, a meta-analysis is when they take data from multiple studies, combine them, conduct a statistical analysis. So it's basically a study of studies. In this analysis here, they had 12 different studies, 26 comparisons. And the response measure I'm going to talk about is production the first, on average, 2 months of lactation. Some studies only measured production up to 28 days, other studies up to 120 days, but the average was 65 days. Again, treatments were imposed prepartum. After cows calved, all the cows were put on the same same diet within an experiment. So we start down here at the boxes. And again, these are multiple studies, so the treatments are not the same. The control diet, which is I'm defining the control as the low protein diet within a study, it ranged from about 10% protein up to about 14%. The average protein in the control diets was about 12%. And this is crude protein. The treatment, which again I'm defining now as the diet with elevated protein, it ranged from about 12% protein up to a high of 23% protein. The average for the treatment diets was approximately 16%. So on average, you're looking at a 4 percentage unit increase in protein prepartum, dietary protein prepartum, and measuring the effects postpartum. If we look at the responses here, if we start here in the middle with the average response to increasing prepartum protein was essentially 0, 0.2 pounds increase. We can't measure that even under research conditions. If we look at the ranges, some studies reported that increasing protein reduced production by about 1.3 pounds. And other studies, it increased production up to 2.6 pounds. So wide range of responses. If we just divide the studies into those that had a negative response, and a negative could be as little as minus 0.1 pounds, or a positive. And again, a positive could be as small as a 0.1 pound increase. You'll see about half the studies found a decrease in production, most of which were never significant. Half the studies found an increase in production, most of which were not statistically significant. So the conclusion from this meta-analysis is if you feed 12% crude protein, you don't expect much of a response in milk production postpartum. Now, criticism of that study is it was based on crude protein. We now usually formulate diets for metabolizable, or MP. So a very recent meta-analysis did essentially the same thing. They combined studies where prepartum protein differed, and in this case, they converted everything to metabolizable protein. They looked at 27 different studies, 125 treatment means. And again, these were imposed prepartum. And they reported it on grams per day rather than a percent. And for cows, so this would be cows starting their second or later lactation, the range in MP intakes went from about 600 grams a day, which is a pretty low protein diet, up to 1,600 grams per day, which is a pretty high protein diet. And they found no effect on milk production in early lactation or milk protein production in early lactation. The conclusion from this, if you take these MP values and then back convert them into typical proteins, crude proteins, it's saying that 11% crude protein for a cow prepartum is adequate if milk production postpartum is your response variable. The other study here, this older study, said 12 is adequate. So lactating cows, pre-fresh cows, do not need a lot of protein. The exception, though, is heifers starting their first lactation. In this same meta-analysis, this is the range in metabolizable protein intakes fed to heifers. They got a significant increase in milk protein in early lactation of 0.2 pounds. Fat-corrected milk went up 4.4 pounds. So heifers clearly need additional protein. Cows do not. So again, if you take this data and back calculate it into typical crude proteins, it's saying these heifers should be in the pre-fresh diet should be fed about 15% protein. So if you're a big enough farm where you can separate prepartum heifers from prepartum cows, you might have a 12% protein diet for the cows and a 15% protein diet for the heifers. Most farms are going to have to commingle these animals. And so you're looking at somewhere probably 13 or 14% crude protein for this mixed group. It's not quite as much as these heifers need, but it's a good compromise between cows and heifers. Okay, now we're going to switch gears into the fresh group. And we can have two types of fresh groups. One is what I call a transition group. Cows just move in there for a very short period of time, and then you move them out to the high group. Or what I'm going to call as a true fresh group, where they're in there for about 3 weeks. If what your main goal of a fresh cow is to monitor health, this transition group will work. They calve, you move them into this group for 3 to maybe 7 days. You watch them very closely. You take body temps. You do these various health protocols. It's a small pen. You can keep a close eye on these animals. But it's such a short period of time, it's probably not justifiable to have its own diet. In fact, a lot of farms simply, it's a very small group. You won't have a mixture that can handle it. But it's going to be very good facilities, uncrowded, etc. But this I'm not going to talk about because the diet is likely going to be the high diet. The other options or the other effects that a fresh group can do, you can get higher peak productions. You can get better full lactation productions. You can also monitor health and etc. So for these other benefits, what you need is not a three day period. You need about a 3 week. And 3 weeks was chosen because that's when intake still is quite low relative to production. If you make this fresh group much longer, then intakes are catching up to production and you lose the need for this very special diet, which you'll see is also going to be a very expensive diet. So what I'm going to concentrate is on what I'm going to call a fresh group, and it's up to about 3 weeks in milk. It's still going to be an uncrowded pen. You're going to have great facilities, but we are going to have a special diet. Just a reminder, and this I'm sure everybody remembers this, but any grouping system is going to need proper facilities. And again, for fresh cows, uncrowded, lots of space, great cow comfort. You also, if you're going to have another group, you need labor. Somebody's got to mix this feed, somebody's got to move the cows, etc. So these groups don't come free. There's cost. And then also it's additional management. Somebody has to decide when to move cows, diets, etc. And I've had this picture for probably 30 years. This is actually a pre-fresh pen, but it makes the point. If these are the facilities, if they're going to be this crowded, the diet doesn't matter. So don't go to all the work of having a special diet if you cannot have the facilities or do not have facilities on your farm to manage this group correctly. Just stick with the simple program then. Okay. Excuse me. So this fresh group, again, it's 3 weeks. I'm going to talk a lot about how to feed this, and you're going to see a lot of these things I'm recommending have some cost involved. Other cost of having a fresh group is you need a diet. If you're going to go to the trouble of having this fresh group, you've got to mix another diet. That means you might need more inventory, feed inventory. You might need special feeds for this group. It's going to be one more pen you've got to feed, one more batch of feed you got to make. There's labor. And then another issue is this regrouping cost. When you move cows from one pen to another. In different studies, it's been shown to reduce intake in milk. It may change feeding behavior. It may reduce rumination. It increases fights or aggressive interactions. But a lot of these studies are done later in lactation. And you have to remember with fresh cows, you have to move them someplace. They're not regrouping is not an issue, is not an option. They calved, they have to go someplace. So the question is this fresh group, will that cause more regrouping problems than just moving them into a high group or moving them into this interim transition group? And the answer is, I don't know what's worse. There's just, the research is not there to answer this question. But since I don't know the answer, if I'm going to go to the trouble of having a fresh group, and it might cause some regrouping issues, I don't know, it might not. But if I'm going to go to this trouble, I'm going to make it worthwhile. And the way I make this group worthwhile is I feed a very specific diet. And I'm feeding this specific diet not just for the responses I'm going to get this first 3 weeks, but for the responses I might get for several weeks or months after they move into the high group. Okay, so let's get into the nutrition of this fresh group. And again, I'll keep saying this, but it's up to about 3 weeks. Some studies I'm going to show went to 4 weeks, but I think 3 weeks is a nice cutoff for this group. I'm not going to spend much time on minerals and vitamins because I want to emphasize protein and energy. Minerals, I don't think there's any big special need or there is a need, obviously, but nothing special for minerals. I meet the requirements, plus a little bit extra, just like I would do for a high group. One possible exception, and there's limited data on this, but I think it's worth doing, is increasing dietary K, potassium. NRC's requirements around 1.1%. I think this fresh group maybe 1.5 up to 1.7. You got to remember the body water in these cows are changing quite a bit around calving. K is important in body water. If I have a fresh group, I'm going to probably feed more vitamin E. Again, there's limited data on this, but there is some data showing high elevated E postpartum improves mastitis, reduces mastitis, and may reduce metritis. So I think it's worthwhile. The other vitamins are standard NRC, plus, again, a safety factor. And then I have rumen-protected choline here. There's a lot of data showing a positive effect of choline. Most of these studies only go from 30 to maybe 50 days in milk, then it stops. This is not a cheap additive. It's a profitable additive based on the expected response, but it's not cheap. And you have to start thinking, if you're going to be feeding choline to a cow at 100 or 200 days in milk, are they really going to respond? My guess would be no, they're not. But if I can concentrate this additive where I know it's going to work, and I know it's going to work in fresh cows, that's going to increase the profitability. And there's one study, and I don't have the reference here. I should have put it there. I'm sorry. But there's one study where they fed it for the first, I think, 3 or 4 weeks, and then they stopped, and they followed these cows for several weeks afterwards, and that increase in production of several pounds was maintained. So this fresh cow group is a way to use this product for about 3 weeks and still reap benefits for weeks or months afterwards. What I'm going to concentrate here on the rest of the talk is on carbohydrates, fats, so energy, and protein. Some on amino acid, but I'm going to talk mostly about metabolizable protein. Okay. One thing I want to keep emphasizing here, and we, as nutritionists and researchers, we don't do as good a job about this as we should, and that is when we impose a nutrition treatment, we always have to change 2 things. We can never change just one. So in this study, what they're looking at is the concentration of starch in the fresh period. And they had 22% starch or 27% starch. But when they increase starch by 5 units, that means something else had to decrease. And you have to consider what's being substituted. You can't just look at what's being changed. In this study, as starch went up, soy hulls went down. So this low starch diet, 22% starch, had a lot of fiber from soy hulls. The high starch diet here at 27 had much less fiber from soy hulls. They fed the treatment diets for the first 23 days, and then they switched all cows to this carryover diet, which was 29% starch. In this study, they had dry corn at, again, 2 levels of starch, and high moisture corn at the same 2 levels, 22 and 27. What they found is as you fed more starch from dry corn, they get a nice bump in intake, almost 5 pounds. And when we come over here and look at energy corrected milk, they get an increase, but much less than we'd expect. A 5-pound increase in intake should produce about 10 pounds of milk, and they're getting maybe 5 pounds. So what that's telling you is some of this added energy here is saving body condition. So they've responded in intake, they responded in milk, but not as much as we did. But this is saying with dry corn, pushing some starch isn't a bad idea. However, with high moisture corn, first of all, in general, the intakes were low, and they were really low with the high starch, high moisture. Here's the dry corn at low starch, high moisture corn, high starch. They lost 5 pounds of intake, and a huge reduction in milk, 10 pounds, more than 10 pounds actually. So this is saying very clearly, if you've got high moisture corn, you need to watch starch levels carefully. They still lost milk with high moisture corn compared to the dry corn, but not nearly as bad with the high starch. When you look now at the carryover, so again, now all these cows are fed the same diet. What's very common is no carryover effects on intake. All these animals, they're put on the same diet, they ate the same amount, 55 pounds. If we look at milk production, some of the responses stayed the same. In other words, the difference between the high and low starch was maintained. So this is again encouraging, you're suggesting higher starch higher starch in the fresh period carries over and gives you 5-6 pounds more milk for the next, in this case, about 50 days. The negative effect of the high starch, high moisture corn stayed. They didn't catch up. They're not quite as bad, but it's still negative. So this is saying, again, proof or additional evidence that you should not feed high starch, high moisture corn in the fresh period because the cows don't catch up. They did catch up with the lower starch with high moisture corn. You still lost some milk here in early lactation, but then they caught up. So the effect wasn't as negative as it is with high starch, high moisture corn. So next question, how much NDF, and this actually should say how much forage NDF should fresh cows be fed? And then I have a question, how much fat should fresh cows be fed? And these questions seem kind of unrelated, but as with almost every question, the answer is it depends. And actually these two questions are related. In this case here, again, this is a study out of Michigan State. They had 4 treatments, a low and high forage NDF, which means the low forage NDF also was high starch. The high forage NDF was low starch. So again, is this a fiber effect or is this a starch effect? We can't tell. We don't know. There's no way we can answer that question. And then for each fiber level or starch level, they had 0 or 2% saturated fat. In this case, it was Energy Booster 100. They fed this in this experiment for 30 days, and then they switched all cows to a common diet that was 26% starch and 23% forage NDF, no supplemental fat, but they did feed whole cottonseed. So again, the treatments were imposed for 30 days. They looked at how does this affect longer term production. So I want to start here with just the diets during the experimental period. In other words, the treatments were fed during this first 30 days, and this is just the diets with no fat. These cows did what we expected them to do with respect to intake. You feed more forage NDF, intake goes down. Dropped again about 5 pounds, and about 6 pounds. That's exactly what we expect. What didn't exactly happen was, again, a 6-pound drop in intake should drop milk production 10 or 12 pounds. Milk production only lost 4 pounds, which again means that energy has to be coming from someplace. So this high forage diet didn't cost you as much milk as you would think, but it is costing you body weight. And this is exactly what happened. They kind of maintained milk. They didn't eat enough, and they lost 35 pounds more body weight than the low fiber diet. NEFAs were high, BHBAs were high. So again, this is 26% forage NDF without fat is too much. Moderate forage, something around 20% probably is a good number for forage NDF. What about carryover? And again, now for this period of time, these animals are fed the same diet. You can see the intakes actually look like they maintained. The intake difference actually looked like they were maintained. But the cows here in the red bars actually were substantially heavier. So on a body weight basis, intakes weren't different, or actually on a body weight basis, the cows that were fed the high forage NDF diet actually ate a little bit more. But when the bottom line is intake effects didn't carry over very much. Milk production was maintained, or no effect on milk production in the carryover. No effect on body weight change in the carryover effect. But eventually, you're going to have to pay this bill. You are going to have to pay this bill. So again, even though the carryover effects weren't great, weren't substantial with this high forage NDF, you lose some milk in early lactation, and you do have increased risk for ketosis and mobilization. So again, it's suggesting moderate forage NDFs. And again, this is without fat. But they had the 4 treatments. And so now I'm going to show, this is the same, some of this is the exact same data I showed in the previous slide, but now it's all 4 treatments. So when we look, when you add fat to a diet with lower forage, higher starch, they saw almost no effect on intake during the fresh period. This again is when the diets were fed. However, with these high forage, low starch diets, feeding fat, the saturated fat, increased intake by about 5 pounds. And this is similar. We did an experiment several years ago with later lactation cows, or peak lactation cows. They did about the same thing. So feeding fat to lower starch, higher fiber diets into fresh cows increased intake. When we look at energy corrected milk, feeding fat with low forage, high starch, reduced energy corrected milk. Even though they ate about the same, so that means you're saving, this fat is not going into the tank, but it's saving body condition. They're putting this added energy from the fat into the body, or actually mobilizing less, which has some benefits. But you don't expect a big change in intake in milk here. With the high fiber, low starch diets, feeding fat didn't get you very much milk. They ate more, but not a whole lot of milk here. So again, this added energy, these cows are clearly eating more energy. It's not going into the tank, so it's helping preserve body. So you can use this fat. One way to use fat in the fresh cow is to monitor or manage body weight, body condition. But it generally, feeding the saturated fat in the fresh period is likely not going to give you a huge milk response, but it's going to help with body weight, body condition. The carryover here, again, intake, no big effect, which is very typical. Again, just to remind you, the diets were fed the first 30 days. This is when all cows were fed a common diet. No big effect on intake, carryover. But these cows that were fed saturated fat with high starch maintained lower production for the next, in this example, in this experiment, 40 days. They continued to have low production. And so again, you're saving body. This added, they're eating roughly the same, producing less milk. That means some of this energy is going to the body. So again, this just reminds you, if you're one benefit of feeding fat is it does help save body weight, especially with high starch fresh diets. So if that's a challenge, if thin cows are a challenge, you might want to consider this, but don't expect a big milk response. Now, to change another experiment, this is also out of Michigan State, a different type of fat here. The other one was energy booster. This is palmitic acid. And the question they asked here is, when should you supplement feed fat, or when should you start? So they had two common treatments. One is all these treatments started freshening, and they went to 67 days. The control had no added fat. The positive control had 1.5% palmitic acid fed from freshening up to 67 days. So just no fat versus added fat. But then they added two additional treatments which evaluated timing. One treatment, they fed fat up through 24 days and then removed it and followed these cows through to 67 days. And the fourth treatment is they delayed fat feeding until day 24 and then added it. So the light green bars are all the same diet. The darker grayish, blackish green bars are the same diet. This diet here it was a good experimental model, and it should have been included, but on a practical basis, it's not very practical. Most people are not going to feed fat to fresh cows and then pull it out, and it also wasn't very positive. So I'm not going to talk about that diet at all. I want to talk about these other two. If we look at just the diets where it was fat was either fed the entire period or not fed at all the entire period, fat gave a nice response. Supplementing fat got 24 pounds more milk protein over 67 days. It got you 33 pounds more milk fat, again, per cow for the first roughly 2 months. But this came at a rather steep cost. And the cost was these cows lost 50 pounds of body weight, or 50 pounds more body weight than the controls. This bill has to be paid. Someplace it has to be paid. So what about if you delayed fat until day 24, comparing it to no fat? So I'm not comparing it to the all fat. I'm saying no fat, or I'm going to wait 24 days and then feed it. I still got 9 pounds more milk protein, which is a lot less than what I got if I fed it the whole 67 days, but I still got a benefit. I got 26 pounds more milk fat, which is getting pretty close to the milk fat I got when I fed fat the entire period. But I didn't see any difference in body weight. These cows lost 50 pounds. These cows didn't lose any more weight than the cows fed no fat. So the question is this worth it? If I delay, based on this study, if I delay feeding palmitic acid to day 25, I potentially lost 15 pounds of milk protein compared to if I fed fat the entire period. I lost 7 pounds of milk fat. Based on Ohio milk prices, that's about $60. I'm not going to feed 17.5 pounds of palmitic acid. That's going to save me about $13. So I'm still losing a potential of roughly $47. But you have to ask, what is 52 pounds of body weight worth? That's a lot of body weight. That's a lot increased risk for ketosis, etc. In my opinion, this is worth it. Delaying fat feeding until, say, 3 weeks is probably a good idea. Because again, it helps you manage body condition, helps prevent ketosis, etc. But you are giving up potential milk. All right. So now the question is with these fresh cows, what's more important, energy or protein? Over the full lactation cycle, there's no question energy is usually the limiting nutrient. If we can get cows to eat more energy over the lactation, they generally produce more milk. In early lactation, fresh period, this very early lactation, first few weeks, protein is the controlling nutrient, usually, not energy. This study here is out of Europe, and some of these names in here won't make much sense. So I don't want to go into the actual details here. But what I want to talk about here is the control was energy and protein. And then that's the red bars. Then they had a treatment where they kept, or where they dropped both energy and protein. So it's low in protein, low in energy compared to the control. That's the blue bar. This is milk protein yield when they pulled energy and protein out of these fresh cows. This experiment lasted the first 4 weeks of lactation. They lost significant, that's 100 grams, 200.2 pounds of milk protein. When they added back protein to the diet, but not energy. So this gray bar has the same protein as the red bar, but it has the same energy as the blue bar. Just by adding back protein, they got all the milk protein back, every bit of it. But because the diet's low in energy, that energy to make that milk and to make that protein has to come from someplace, and it came from the body. NEFAs went up, ketones, acetoacetate went up, ketones. So this isn't necessarily a good thing. Adding protein without adding energy is not, you'll get a response, but it might be an expensive response, but increased ketosis and thin cows. Excuse me. So that brings us to this study here, which is where they fed a good diet and adequate energy, and they fed really, really high protein to these fresh cows. This is the first 3 weeks of lactation. So they had a diet with 16% protein, crude protein, 19 and 21. So we are getting very high. And they got that high protein. They increased rumen-degradable protein from about 11% up to a little more than 12. They increased rumen-undegradable protein from about 5 up to 8 or 9. And the calculated MP, and they used the NRC model, went from about 11% up to about 12.5%. So big increases in crude protein, big increases in metabolizable protein. And I don't have the exact recipe with me right now, but to get this high protein, they fed fish meal and other high quality proteins. So they didn't specifically put in a rumen protected amino acid, but likely based on the proteins they're feeding, they have a pretty good blend of amino acids as well. When you look at calculated balances here, it took 20% protein or 21% protein to get these cows in calculated protein balance. Whether the models are appropriate for these fresh cows is a debatable question. But if we're using the NRC model, it took 21% protein to get these cows into protein balance because they're eating low intakes and high production. So what did this do? Well, first of all, there was very little difference between 19 and 21%. So I'm just going to identify these as high protein, and this means that in general, 19% crude protein, which would be, again, somewhere around almost 11.5, 12% MP, was adequate. High protein increased milk, increased dry matter intake, about 5 pounds. And again, in an early lactation cow, 5 pounds of intake is a huge amount. They got a nice increase in milk production, about 10 pounds. Fat-corrected milk went up about 7 or 8 pounds. And again, no statistical difference between 19 and 21. Milk fat percent went down, but fat yield went up. Milk protein percent went up. Milk protein yield went up. So in this case, again, these cows responded to higher protein. But again, earlier I said just because they respond to high protein can actually be bad, because if it causes increased mobilization of body energy, long term that could be bad. But these high protein diets here, remember, they got an increase in intake, and also an increase in energy intake. So when we look at NEFAs and ketones, the diet that produced the least amount of milk, the control here, the 16% protein, had the lowest milk yield. it had the highest NEFAs. It had the highest ketones. These higher protein diets, NEFAs were lower, ketones were lower, even though these animals were producing more milk. So in this experiment, this high protein diets, or these high protein diets, increased intake. I didn't show you this data, but it also increased digestibility, which means the mega cows per pound increased, the pounds of feed increased. So these animals were eating more energy, in addition to more protein. So these high protein diets, if it's the right balance of protein, that will not necessarily be detrimental to these cows. You'll get increased production, but because they eat more and digest more, energy is not as big a problem, or energy mobilization is not as big a problem. Okay. The last experiment I want to talk about is one we did here a couple years ago. And we had 3 treatments. The control here at 16% crude protein. It met, the treatments were imposed the first 25 days of lactation. Using the NRC model, we met 85% of the MP requirement. We paid no attention to lysine or methionine. It was what it was. Then we had a diet of high protein. We didn't go as high as the study I just showed you. We did our study first, 18.5% protein. And we met 95% of the MP requirement. We increased RUP and we increased RDP. But again, we paid no attention to amino acids. So it's essentially the same amino acid profile as the control, but higher MP. And our third treatment here is called MP plus amino acids. We used a commercial blood meal-based product. It elevated lysine and methionine into close to what's commonly recommended. It met the same MP requirements as the high protein. It's not as high in crude protein because we have less degradable protein in this diet. Still plenty, but less. We thought that additional RDP might actually increase intake. That didn't pan out. When we look at production during the phase when the treatments were imposed, we did get more intake with the high protein with amino acids. The high protein by itself did not statistically increase intake. Fat percent went up for the high protein diet, statistically elevated in protein percents, on fat percents. Milk fat yields, statistically higher with the high protein diets. Milk protein percent was elevated by the amino acid treatment, not the high protein, but milk protein yield wasn't affected. So the main effect during the application of treatment was increased milk fat. We took these cows off these experimental diets and we fed them all the control diet. So from starting on day 25, all these animals were switched to the control diet. We don't have intake here because these are pen-fed animals. Milk fat stayed high for the cows that were fed the amino acids. And remember, now they are not being fed this diet anymore, but milk fat percent stayed high, fat yield stayed high. So we still got more milk fat for the next roughly 50 days, 60 days after we stopped feeding it. So we paid for this diet for 3 weeks. We're still reaping benefits for the next 50 days. Now, some of you would say, well, this high fat means they're mobilizing body weight. I didn't show the data, but blood ketones were not, during this phase, blood ketones did not differ. They were low for all diets. Blood NEFAs did not differ because of treatments, and they were acceptable for all diets. Body weight change was not different. So this added fat here, fat yield is not coming from the body. So again, an expensive diet for the first 3 weeks reaped benefits for the next 50 or 60 days. So to wrap up here, in the Prefresh, most of the data just says a moderate starch diet is fine. You go too high in starch, you run the risk of excessive mobilization of body weight postpartum. for cows. I say moderate, but actually cows, it can be low. There's just no evidence saying high protein for cows has any benefit after they calve. There's a clear benefit to feeding more protein to heifers in the pre-fresh period. Again, using the diets, the experiments were based on MP, converting back to CP. Heifers should be fed prepartum 15% protein diet, cows 12%. A mixed diet, you want to go lean toward feeding the heifers correctly, but I don't think you need to go 15% when 2/3 of the cows in that group are cows. So a mixed group of heifers and cows, 13 or 14% is probably adequate. You do have to feed for prevent hypocalcemia. I didn't talk about that on purpose. Other people have given seminars on that. And again, energy balance. Feed these cows so they're gaining the right amount of energy, not getting fat. They're providing energy for the fetus and maintaining themselves. They're in the right energy balance. For the fresh group, and again, I'm defining this as a 3-week period. It's moderate. It's what your mother said about what we should eat. Everything in moderation. Starch around 25%. Forage NDF around 20%. If you are going to feed fat, go with lower starch diets. And again, fat in this very early lactation phase oftentimes is more for managing body condition than increase in production. If ketosis is an issue and body condition is an issue, I delay fat, especially palmitic fats, until 3 weeks late after calving, because there's data showing feeding these starting at calving causes substantial losses in body weight. If you're feeding high moisture corn, and this is likely true for barley as well, barley grain, because of the fermentability of the starch, keep starch moderate. There was that one study with high moisture corn and 27% starch was clearly very negative in the fresh period, and those effects lingered for several weeks after the fresh period. Fresh cows need a lot of MP on a concentration basis because they don't eat very much. Again, around 12% showed a nice response. They get intake, they get milk. And I didn't go much into this, but if you're going to balance for amino acids in these fresh groups, when we do this in later lactation, a lot of people feed balanced amino acids and feed lower protein diets, and they work. But for these fresh cows, I would not take that approach. You might want to balance for amino acids, but I think you still need to feed high MPs because of all these other effects protein does. It stimulates intake, helps digestibility. And with that, I thank you. I'll turn it back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss, for that informative presentation. And once again, thanks to QLF, Quality Liquid Feeds, for sponsoring this webinar session. If you want to view this webinar again, or any of our previous webinars, you can visit the archives anytime at www.hoards.com/webinars. And we'll hope you'll make plans to attend our next webinar, which will take place on Monday, January 13th, 2020 at noon Central Time. The title of that presentation is The Dairy Situation and Outlook for 2020. And our presenter will be Mark Stevenson with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he will be taking some time to give his forecast for milk prices and dairy in general for the upcoming year. The sponsor of that presentation will be Zinpro Performance Minerals. Then in February, on the 10th, we'll be focusing on feeding the pre-weaned calf. And that presentation will be given by Michael Steele from the University of Guelph up in Canada. So we hope that you will make plans to join us for our future webinars in the upcoming year. Once again, I do want to send a thank you to QLF Quality Liquid Feeds for partnering with us and sponsoring this webinar. Their support is greatly appreciated. And a big thank you to Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University for a great presentation with a lot of really good information for people to use on their farms and with the clients that they work with. We will be getting together again on January 13th, noon Central Time, to talk about dairy prices, and we hope that you'll make plans to join us for that. And since we are closing out the year, as we approach the end of 2019, I would like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for webinars during this past year. I hope these presentations have been useful to you, and we look forward to another year of webinars in 2020. From all of us here at Hoards Dairyman and our team at the University of Illinois, we wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Take care, and we will talk to you again next year.